talking to Dr. Slade Billew of the SFA School of Theater and wondering what you did in your teaching in the second half of this semester during the COVID time to keep the teaching and learning going theatrically.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Scott. I'm happy to talk about it. An interesting, I guess, struggle for me from the first moment that all this came to light is that I teach mostly, particularly this semester, I'm teaching entirely movement-based classes, right? So I'm teaching courses that are focused on bodies moving through space and making kind of fine adjustments to students' movement, sometimes through touch, sometimes verbally, but always in a context where it's very helpful to be in the room with people. And particularly the latter part of the semester is usually stage combat. And so doing stage combat in a situation where people can't have a scene partner, are kind of doing only one side of the fight, really, has been an interesting experience. So I'll talk about that for a minute. Fortunately, I grew up in the martial arts community in the 80s and 90s, and so I got very used to watching, martial arts training videos. I even was in a couple in my 20s and 30s, and so I went back to kind of that process, and we really started approaching on the stage combat side, approaching it almost like a martial arts form. And then layering acting choices on top of that, right? So that we have these are the basic movements, let's get the movement down, and then we can start on a movement level to look at how do you play this reaction? How do you react to this? And the students have taken to that really well. I was surprised, I think they were surprised. Many of them were quite anxious initially about trying to learn this sort of thing online. But I think they've been surprised at how well they took to it. One issue that we've dealt with is students who kind of process movement differently or process space differently, and looking at how to talk about things like left and right when you're looking at a camera, but I'm reversed on the camera from what you're seeing, and so those dynamics have been really interesting. I'm fortunate that I part of my history of training is that I can pretty much do any choreography on either side of my body. So it's not super hard for me to just switch and do it on the other side. And so I've done that a fair amount, a lot of changing of camera angles. We've also had a lot of fun with Zoom. Some of my students, individual students, have done one-on-one Zoom sessions where they'll show me their choreography and I'll give them personalized feedback on it, which has been really helpful. Another area of my teaching that, honestly, when all this started, my initial thought was, I think we're just going to have to give this up, was one of the things that I teach in Movement 2 is clowning. And I don't teach clowning to turn people into clowns, but I teach it because something that's fundamental to clowning is emotional vulnerability with an audience. And so we use it as a way to explore that audience-actor relationship, which is obviously very different in a context where there's not a physical audience there. And so I kind of avoided it for a couple of weeks. I thought about it in the back of my head, but it's let's not try to do that yet. And then I talked to the students and said, okay, what if we try this in Zoom? Let's see what happens. And so we had a day that was just okay, here we are in Zoom. We're going to try to clown and let's see what happens. And what we found is that we were able to play really interestingly with the camera as a scene partner and ways that you could move in relation to the camera. And clowning is also, in addition to vulnerability, is all about kind of problem solving. And so it became a question of creating a problem. And so the students, over a few weeks, we would meet and do this every week, and they would, over a few weeks, develop individual clown pieces using the camera. And I was, honestly, when we started, I thought, well, these will be okay and they'll get us through and we can say we did the thing. But they ended up turning into really interesting pieces that were entertaining and funny and clever. And I've been really just overall impressed and surprised with the resourcefulness of our students and their willingness to just go along and say, all right, well, we'll figure this out. We're all figuring this out together. And I think they've really embraced that in a way that's been really wonderful for me as a teacher.
I have a pretty prosaic question about this, actually.
Great.
Because I've been in a whole lot of Zoom meetings in the last 2 months, and generally they're talking heads sessions like we're having right now.
Right.
When you need to express via the whole body, does the student just stand further away from the computer and you get a longer shot?
We've played with a few different things. So for the stage combat, yes, usually they just back up away from the camera. Or at the very beginning of this, in the Movement 1 classes, we were still finishing up our work on the viewpoints. So they were doing viewpointing kind of back away from the camera. With the clowning, we got into some kind of interesting things, because usually the fundamental structure of a clown piece is the clown enters, something happens, and the clown exits. And so students started to get really creative with the way that they would enter the screen. So sometimes they would play with the ability to turn the camera on and off. I had a student who would enter foot first. So the first thing you would see is her foot come down into the screen. And so we've been playing with a range of different ways of relating to the camera, and also like playing with the difference of what happens if I move in relation to the camera versus what happens if the camera moves. And how does that work, and how does that change the story that we're telling?
How would the camera
well, so obviously, I mean, yes, I am physically moving the camera, but like the difference between, I don't know if this will come through in the video, but the difference between like me leaning away from the camera and me staying static and the camera moving backwards.
Oh, okay.
Right? Or the camera turning in some way, right? That we can play with. Or one student had a piece that was all about her. I think she was using her phone. And so it was a piece that was all about her trying to get the camera in the right orientation. And so you kept kind of seeing her fingers in front of the camera, and then it would move and shift, and you'd like see like flashes of her face as you went through the piece.
It's fun just watching you describe it, actually. It sounds like it would be very interesting. So I imagine that the students are all living in very different kinds of situations, and I wonder if you've run into students trying to create a clown piece, or maybe even crazier, swing a sword or the equivalent, in a situation where the parents are in the room, or younger children are nearby playing, or the pets are interrupting. Any of those things happening?
Absolutely. On the clown front, I had a couple of students incorporate their pets into their clown pieces. We had pieces that included a cat or included a dog. Several of the stage combat students have actually been really helped by that, because in that kind of process of trying to figure out how does this movement work in space, having a parent or a sibling where they can say like, hey, come here and let me try to figure this out with you as a partner, has been really helpful for them. Actually had a student whose mom ended up assisting their clown piece last week. So it's been interesting. I mean, at the same time, right, with students at home, they're picking up responsibilities in terms of sibling care or that sort of thing that they don't always have here. I have had students call into class, while also nannying or also watching their siblings, or that sort of thing. And so, but overall, it hasn't really been a problem. It's just been kind of an additional dynamic in the piece. I think the biggest struggle that we've had has probably been the range of actual internet access that students have. Because we have a number of students who have a lot of internet access, and then we have students who either for just location reasons, because they live very far out in the country, or just various infrastructure reasons, have intermittent access to the internet. And so we've had to find various ways around that. Some of them I've been able to meet one-on-one. Some students have ended up giving written assignments to instead of physical assignments, just because there's just no way that they can access video in that way. And then even like random things. Like last week here, we had a giant thunderstorm, one morning. And so I got a ton of emails from students like, hey, my power's out. So I can't come to class. And so those sorts of things have been going on.
Well, I sympathize with all that. My dog is resting quietly, fortunately, at the moment, but my power was out a week or so ago, and I sympathize with some of those things, and I appreciate your flexibility about it. Here's a question that I hope is a little less prosaic, and maybe you can talk about it even a little bit philosophically.
Mm-hmm.
The nature of a human being in motion is that it's a three-dimensional
Right.
thing in space, and you're trying to teach it, learn it, depict it on a two-dimensional screen. What are the limitations? Do you learn anything extra by doing it that way, or what's it?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot, particularly as you know, and maybe we'll get into this here, or maybe we'll talk about it later, but I'm directing the summer stage show this summer, and we're doing it entirely online. And initially I was despite the fact that I was actually the person who ended up pushing for that, initially I was very resistant to the idea. Initially I was like, that's not theater, like we're not live in the space, what are we doing? But the more I think about it, I think a few things come clear for me, and particularly the students' work with the clowning has brought some of that into greater clarity for me. The ways in which the human body always exists in the medium, right? That we even if whether it's live space or whether it's recorded, we are always existent in a space and in an environment. So like the students were doing viewpoints performances, and even though it's on camera, like they're playing with depth of space. They're playing with the relationship of the light coming in the window versus the light here, right? And so even in a flat format, we can still get that sense of depth and space and dimensionality of the body, which is interesting. And then I also think, just in terms of this is maybe more prosaic, but thinking in terms of moving students into the profession, right? More and more young actors are getting their start, on YouTube or through making small projects with friends and posting them on the internet. And we obviously have an acting for the camera course, but we haven't had, to my knowledge, training that really engaged with how does this kind of interaction work as performance. And so I think, as much as this is not the way I'd prefer to do it, I think it's great that we at least have the opportunity to explore those things and give students access to that in a environment where they're free to learn and make mistakes and figure things out.
Well, it's fascinating, and I not only appreciate your flexibility, but just your inventiveness and creativity in keeping it all going for the students. And it sounds really fun, to be honest with you. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you want to say about how your teaching has gone for this second half of the semester, the COVID part of the term?
No, I think we covered most of the things. I think the only thing I would come back to is just again, one of the things that drew me to SFA when I was looking when I was on the job market, and one of the things that's kept me here is our students and how committed they are and how hard they work. And I've just seen that even more clearly in this environment, right? That like even the students who are struggling financially or struggling in terms of internet access or all of those things are still working incredibly hard to be present and do the work and stay in contact. And that's, I think this whole thing would have been much, much harder for me without their commitment and energy.
Yeah. Well, I too am inspired by the students, and I'm inspired by you and our faculty colleagues, and I thank you very much for taking the time to talk about it.
Thank you. I'm happy to talk about it.